A billionaire finds a homeless boy rummaging through his fridge. But what he does next? Fernando Lopez, a prominent textile magnate, stepped into his grand mansion with a weary gait. The polished marble floors echoed beneath his expensive Italian shoes, amplifying the emptiness that had consumed him for the past 5 years. Ever since that devastating accident claimed the lives of his wife Camilla and son Thomas, the sprawling house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "Good evening, Mr. Lopez." Rogelio, the head of security, greeted him with a respectful nod. Fernando gave only a faint, distracted acknowledgement as his mind flitted between the endless figures from his board meeting and the gnawing hollowness in his chest. Loosening his tie, he made his way toward the kitchen, hoping to find something to quiet a hunger he hadn't realized he had. That's when he saw him. A scrawny boy, no older than 10, with messy hair and tattered clothes, was rummaging through the refrigerator. For a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. The boy froze, his wide, terrified eyes locking onto Fernando's. "Hey you!" Fernando shouted, startled more than angry. Like a cornered animal, the boy slammed the fridge door shut and bolted for the service exit, clutching a piece of cheese and an apple. Still dazed, Fernando shouted for Rogelio. "There's an intruder in the kitchen," he yelled as he chased after the boy. Rogelio appeared as though summoned, catching the boy just as he tried to scale the garden fence. The guard grabbed him firmly, but carefully. "Let me go. I didn't do anything wrong," the boy protested, kicking and flailing. Fernando, breathless from the unexpected chase, approached the boy. Seeing him up close, something in the boy's dark eyes struck him, a raw mix of desperation and defiance. "Wait, Rogelio," Fernando ordered, raising a hand. "Don't call the police yet." He crouched down, meeting the boy at eye level. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The boy hesitated, glancing nervously between Fernando and Rogelio before finally answering in a faint voice. "Mateo," he said. "All right, Mateo," Fernando continued. "Why were you stealing food from my house?" The boy lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his face. "I was hungry," he admitted quietly. "I haven't eaten in 3 days." Fernando felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The thought of a child starving on the streets while he lived surrounded by excess struck him as deeply unjust. "Let him go," Fernando instructed. Rogelio hesitated. "But sir, he broke into your property," he argued. "I know," Fernando replied firmly, still looking at Mateo. "But I think we can make an exception this time." As Rogelio released him, the boy's confused yet hopeful gaze lingered on Fernando, who felt an unfamiliar warmth in the act of kindness. "Mateo, do you have anywhere to stay tonight?" The boy shook his head. At that moment, Fernando made a decision, one that would forever alter the course of his life. "Then you'll stay here tonight," he said, surprising even himself. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." Mateo's eyes widened, clearly stunned by what he had just heard. "Are you serious?" he asked with a shaky voice. Fernando nodded, offering a genuine smile for the first time in years. "Come on, you must be hungry. Let's get you something to eat." As they walked back to the house, Fernando couldn't shake the feeling of how unusual this moment was. For the first time in years, it felt like something had shifted in his otherwise predictable life. He couldn't explain it, but this boy's unexpected presence had awakened something he thought he'd lost forever. Later that night, as Mateo slept in the guest room, Fernando stayed up, staring at an old family photo. For a brief moment, he thought he caught a flicker of hope in his own reflection. The next morning, Fernando woke up with an odd feeling, as if he'd had a vivid dream, but couldn't quite remember it. It took him a few seconds to recall the events of the night before. He had actually taken in a homeless child. The thought seemed as reckless as it was unbelievable in the light of day. He got dressed quickly and headed downstairs, half expecting to find the house empty and the whole thing to have been a figment of his imagination. But when he walked into the kitchen, he froze at the sight before him. Matteo was seated at the table, wolfing down a plate of scrambled eggs that Carmen, the housekeeper, had prepared. She stood nearby, her expression a mix of worry and tenderness, as though she wasn't quite sure how to handle this unexpected guest. "Good morning, Mr. Lopez," Carmen greeted, clearly uneasy. "I hope you don't mind. I gave the boy some breakfast." Fernando shook his head, still trying to process the scene. No, you did the right thing. "Thank you, Carmen," he said, as he walked to the table and took a seat across from Matteo, who looked up at him with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Good morning, Matteo. Did you sleep well?" The boy nodded, quickly swallowing the bite of food in his mouth. "Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me stay." Fernando noticed that Matteo seemed more at ease than the night before, though his posture still hinted at a readiness to bolt if necessary. "Matteo," Fernando began cautiously, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to tell me a little more about yourself. Where are you from? Where's your family?" The boy's face darkened immediately. He set his fork down and lowered his gaze. "I don't have a family," he murmured. "Well, I had a grandmother, but she passed away a few months ago. Since then, I've been on the streets." Fernando felt a sharp ache in his chest. Matteo's story hit far too close to home. "And your parents?" he asked, even though he dreaded the answer. Matteo shrugged. "I never met them. My grandmother used to say my mum was very young when she had me, and my dad left before I was born." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Fernando fought the urge to comfort the boy, to promise that everything would be fine. But how could he make such a promise? Finally he spoke. "Listen, Matteo, I can't let you go back to the streets. It's dangerous and, well, it's just not right. But I can't just adopt you either. We need to figure something out." Matteo's eyes lit up. A flicker of hope mingled with distrust. "You mean I can stay here a little longer?" Fernando surprised himself again, just as he had earlier. "Yes, for now. But we'll need some rules, and we'll have to see what's best for your future." Just then, Rogelio entered the kitchen, breaking the moment. "Mr. Lopez, sorry to interrupt, but there's an urgent call from the office." Fernando sighed. As he stood, he realized how his world had shifted. Hours ago, his life had been a predictable routine of work and solitude. Now, he had a street kid under his roof. "Thanks, Rogelio. I'll take it in my office." Turning to Matteo, he softened his tone. "Why don't you ask Carmen to show you around the house? We'll talk more later." On his way to his desk, Fernando couldn't help but marvel at how surreal the situation felt. The call from his office turned out to be about a crisis at one of his factories. Yet, as the details unfolded, his mind wandered back to Matteo. What was he going to do? He couldn't send the boy back to the streets, but he wasn't prepared to play the role of a father either. Memories of his late son, Tomas, crept into his mind, piercing him with grief. After hanging up, Fernando sat at his desk, staring at a photo of Camila and Tomas. What would they think of all this, he wondered. Would they approve of his decision to help Matteo? A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening up in his chair. To his surprise, it was Matteo, looking nervous as he stepped into the office. "Excuse me, Mr. Lopez," the boy began hesitantly. "Carmen said I could explore the house, but I think I got lost." Fernando couldn't help but smile. "Don't worry, Matteo. This place can feel like a maze at first. Sit down." He gestured toward a chair. Matteo sat, wide-eyed at the opulent furniture and paintings on the walls. "Your house is amazing," he said with awe. "I've never seen anything like it." The child's innocence and wonder stirred something in Fernando. For a moment, he saw himself through Mateo's eyes, a wealthy man living alone in a mansion. "Thank you, Mateo. But you know, sometimes I think this house is too big for one person." The boy looked at him with curiosity, his expression thoughtful. "He doesn't have a family, Mr. Lopez." The straightforward, sincere question hit Fernando like a hammer, tightening his throat. He hesitated before answering, his voice trembling. "I used to," he finally admitted, "but I lost them a long time ago." Mateo stayed silent for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of the words. "I'm sorry," he eventually said. "I've lost my family too. It's sad, isn't it?" Fernando nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, he felt like someone truly understood his pain. After a long pause, Fernando said softly, "Mateo, would you like to stay here for a while? At least until we figure out a better solution for you?" The boy's eyes lit up. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" Fernando shook his head, feeling a small spark of life rekindling in his heart. "No, I wouldn't mind. Actually, I think I could use the company." Mateo beamed, his genuine smile lighting up the room. "Thank you, Mr. Lopez. I promise I'll behave and won't cause any trouble." Fernando stood, walked around his desk, and placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sure you will, Mateo, and please just call me Fernando." As they left the office together, Fernando felt a shift deep inside. He couldn't predict what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. What neither of them realized in that moment was that this marked the beginning of a journey that would change them both, challenging their views of the world and themselves, and creating a bond neither could have imagined. In the days that followed, the Lopez mansion buzzed with activity. Fernando, used to his solitary routine, suddenly found himself navigating decisions and preparations he hadn't faced in years. First on the list, buying new clothes for Mateo. The boy, accustomed to wearing worn-out second-hand garments, was stunned when Fernando took him to a high-end store at the mall. "All of this is for me?" Mateo asked, his eyes wide with excitement as he wandered through aisles of colorful clothes and gleaming shoes. Fernando nodded, a mix of satisfaction and guilt washing over him. How long had it been since this boy had owned anything new? "Pick whatever you want, Mateo. You need a full wardrobe." As Mateo tried on outfit after outfit, Fernando couldn't help but think of the times he'd done this with Tomas. Nostalgia and pain intertwined with a newfound sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. When they left the store loaded with bags, Fernando noticed Mateo walking a bit awkwardly. "Are you okay, Mateo?" he asked, concerned. The boy nodded, but Fernando could tell he was hiding something. "It's the new shoes, isn't it? They're hurting your feet, aren't they?" Mateo looked down, embarrassed. "A little. I'm just not used to wearing shoes all the time." Fernando's heart ached. How long had this boy been without proper shoes? "Don't worry," Fernando said, trying to sound cheerful. "New shoes always feel a little uncomfortable at first. You'll get used to them." Back at the mansion, Fernando found himself facing another challenge, Mateo's education. It turned out the boy could barely read or write, and his math skills were almost non-existent. "We need to get you a tutor," Fernando decided one afternoon, after a frustrating hour trying to explain how to add fractions. "Someone who can help you catch up on your studies." Mateo shrank into his chair, his voice trembling. "Do I have to? I'm not really good at school." Fernando knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. "Mateo, you're a smart kid, You just need the chance to learn, and I'm going to make sure you get that chance." Mateo's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing all this for me, Fernando? No one's ever been this kind to me before." Fernando felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain to this boy that in some way Mateo was giving him a new purpose? "Because I believe you deserve a chance, Mateo, and because you remind me there's still good in this world." That night, after tucking Mateo into bed, Fernando stayed up late flipping through old photo albums. He stopped at a picture of Tomas, smiling and carefree on his 10th birthday, the same age Mateo was now. "What am I doing, Camilla?" he murmured, running a finger over the photograph of his late wife. "Am I trying to replace our son?" There was no answer, of course, just the silence of the night and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, under Fernando's care, Mateo began to thrive. The tutor they hired, a kind and patient woman named Sophia, managed to spark in Mateo a love for learning he'd never known before. "Look, Fernando!" Mateo shouted one afternoon, running toward him with a notebook in hand. "I got an A on my math test." Fernando felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. "That's amazing, Mateo. I'm so proud of you." The words came out before he could think, and for a moment, both of them froze. It was the first time Fernando had openly expressed his pride in Mateo. With eyes shining with excitement, the boy flung himself into Fernando's arms, holding on tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for believing in me." Fernando hugged him back, feeling something thaw inside him. Maybe, he thought, this was what healing felt like. But not everything was smooth sailing. As Mateo settled into his new life, difficult questions began to surface. One evening at dinner, Mateo dropped a bombshell. "Fernando, what's going to happen to me when you don't want me here anymore?" Fernando nearly choked on his food. "What? Mateo, where is this coming from?" The boy fidgeted with his fork, avoiding eye contact. "It's just, this is too good to be true. And good things don't last, you know? At least not for me." Fernando felt like he'd been punched in the gut. How could he possibly make this kid understand that he had no intention of leaving him? "Mateo, look at me," he said firmly but gently. "I don't know what the future holds, but I promise you one thing. As long as I'm here, you will always have a home. I'm not going to push you away or leave you. Do you understand?" Mateo nodded hesitantly, but Fernando could see he wasn't fully convinced, and honestly, he couldn't blame him. How could he ask Mateo to trust him completely when life had taught the boy the exact opposite? That night, after Mateo fell asleep, Fernando found himself poring over legal documents and making late-night calls to his lawyer. If he was going to commit to this, if he truly wanted to be there for Mateo, he needed to do it the right way. He wanted to give the boy the stability and security he deserved. Yet, as Fernando planned their future, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but that felt like it could change everything. What Fernando didn't know was that a sudden discovery would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about Mateo, himself, and what family truly meant. His transformation was hard to miss. Friends and colleagues noted that he smiled more often, showed up later to the office, and even left earlier than usual. During board meetings, he seemed less consumed by profit margins and more focused on the human impact of his decisions. One evening, while reviewing reports in his home office, a loud crash came from the attic. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, Fernando rushed up, fearing that Mateo might be hurt. "Mateo, are you okay?" he called out, throwing the attic door open. What he saw stopped him cold. Mateo stood amidst a chaotic mess of overturned boxes and scattered items, But it wasn't the clutter that froze him. Clutched tightly in Matteo's trembling hands was a framed photograph. "I'm sorry," Matteo stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean to. I was just looking around. And—" Fernando stepped closer, his heart pounding. He recognized the photo instantly. It was of Tomás, carefree and grinning, taken on his last birthday before the accident. "It's okay, Matteo," Fernando said, trying to steady his voice. "You didn't do anything wrong." But Matteo didn't seem to hear him. His gaze was fixed on the picture, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "Fernando," Matteo whispered, "who is this boy? He looks just like me." For a moment, Fernando's world seemed to stand still. He couldn't deny it. The resemblance between Matteo and Tomás was uncanny. It was something he'd noticed before, but had never allowed himself to truly consider. Fernando finally spoke, his voice trembling. "That was my son, Thomas. He passed away 5 years ago, along with my wife, Camilla." Matteo looked up, his eyes a mix of emotions Fernando couldn't quite decipher. "That's why you took me in, isn't it? Because I remind you of him." The question hit Fernando like a punch to the gut. Was it true? Had he seen a replacement for his lost son in Matteo? "No, Matteo, it's not like that," he said, but even to his own ears, his voice lacked conviction. "I took you in because you needed help, because you're a good kid who deserves a chance." But the damage was done. Matteo carefully placed the photograph back down and stepped away. "I think I need to be alone for a while," he mumbled before running out of the attic. Fernando stood there, surrounded by the memories of his past life, feeling as if everything he had built over the past few months was crumbling around him. Dinner that evening was tense and quiet. Matteo barely touched his food, and Fernando struggled to find the words to bridge the sudden gap between them. Finally, Matteo spoke. "I know what you found today must be confusing and painful, but I want you to know, it's okay, Fernando." Matteo's tone carried a surprising maturity. "I understand that you must miss your son a lot, and if you want me to leave, I'll understand." Fernando's heart broke at those words. "No, Matteo, I don't want you to go," he said firmly. "Look, it's true that at first, you might have reminded me of Thomas in some way. But these past few months, you've shown me who you are. You're your own person, unique and incredible. You're not a replacement for anyone." Matteo's eyes filled with tears. "Do you really mean that?" "Absolutely," Fernando said, reaching across the table to hold Matteo's hand. "You're part of my life now, Matteo. And if you're willing, I'd like you to stay." Slowly, a small smile spread across Matteo's face. "I want to stay too, Fernando," he whispered. That night, after tucking Matteo into bed, Fernando stayed up late, reflecting on the day's events. He knew there was still a long road ahead and that this conversation was just the beginning. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. What Fernando didn't know was that fate had more surprises in store for both him and Matteo. In another part of the city, a woman stared at an old photograph, tears streaming down her face. It was a picture of a baby who looked strikingly like Matteo. She sighed, slipping the photograph into her bag. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "tomorrow I'll finally have the courage to find Fernando Lopez and reveal the truth I've kept hidden all these years." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Fernando awoke with a start, shaken by a restless dream he couldn't remember. Fernando got up and headed to the kitchen, surprised to find Matteo already awake, sitting at the table with a notebook in front of him. "Good morning, Matteo," he greeted, doing his best to sound cheerful. "What are you doing up so early?" Matteo looked up, and Fernando noticed the dark circles under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept well. "I was drawing," Mateo said, sliding the notebook toward Fernando. As Fernando picked it up, his breath caught. The drawing showed two figures, a tall man in a suit and a small boy, both smiling and holding hands. Below it, Mateo had written in shaky letters, "My new family." Fernando tried to respond, but his throat tightened. "Mateo, this is—" he started, but couldn't finish. "I know I'm not Tomas," Mateo said softly, "and I know I can never replace him. But do you think we could be, some kind of family? You and me?" Fernando put down the notebook, walked around the table and knelt beside Mateo, pulling him into a tight hug. "We already are, Mateo," he whispered. "A different kind of family, but a family all the same." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Fernando frowned, wondering who could possibly be at the door this early in the morning. "Stay here," he told Mateo. "I'll go see who it is." Opening the door, he was met by a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired but determined eyes. "Mr. Lopez," the woman asked. "I'm Elena Gomez. I need to speak with you about Mateo." Fernando felt a chill run through him. "What do you know about Mateo?" he asked, his body tensing. Elena took a deep breath, as if summoning courage. I'm his grandmother," she said. The words hit like a thunderclap, shattering the quiet of the entryway. Fernando froze, struggling to process what he'd just heard. "But Mateo said his grandmother passed away," he managed to say, at last. Elena nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I know," she said. "It's a long story, Mr. Lopez, one that involves your wife, Camilla." Fernando felt the air leave his lungs. What did Camilla have to do with this? "You'd better come in," he said, stepping aside and gesturing for Eleanor to enter. He led her to his study, closing the door behind them. He didn't want Mateo overhearing, at least not until he understood what this was all about. "Please, have a seat," Fernando said, working hard to keep his composure. "Now, explain what's going on." Elena sat down, twisting a handkerchief nervously in her hands. "Mr. Lopez," she began, her voice trembling. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change a lot of things. But before I start, please understand, my daughter, Laura, never meant to hurt anyone." Fernando frowned in confusion. "Your daughter? What does she have to do with any of this?" Elena took another deep breath before continuing. "Laura was a nurse at the hospital where your wife, Camilla, gave birth to your son, Tomas." Fernando's heart skipped a beat. "What does the birth of Tomas have to do with Mateo?" he asked. Elena's voice shook as she said, "The night Camilla gave birth, there was a mix-up in the newborn unit. Laura was on duty that evening." Fernando jolted upright, gasping for air as though the walls were closing in on him. "What are you trying to say?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and dread. Elena met his gaze, her own eyes brimming with tears that streaked her cheeks. "There was an accidental baby swap, Mr. Lopez," she said softly. "The boy you and Camilla raised as Tomas. He isn't your biological son." Fernando felt the world around him freeze, the words echoing in his mind, but refusing to make sense. It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake. No way," he stammered, shaking his head vigorously. "That's not possible." Tomas was his son. He looked like him, like Camilla. Eleanor, her tone gentle but firm, replied, "Babies can resemble many people, Mr. Lopez, but DNA tests don't lie." Fernando sank heavily into his chair. "DNA tests? What tests?" he asked hoarsely. Elena reached into her bag, pulling out an envelope and placing it on the desk. "Laura found out about the mix-up years ago," she explained, her voice tinged with regret. She did the tests secretly, tormented by guilt. But by then the boys were already several years old. She didn't know how to come forward. Fernando's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope, though he couldn't bring himself to open it. He wasn't ready to see what it held. "Are you telling me that Mateo—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. Elena nodded slowly. "Mateo is your biological son, Mr. Lopez. The boy you and Camilla had 12 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Fernando felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. The world spun in a chaotic blur, and nothing made sense anymore. For all these years, he'd been caring for his own child without knowing it. The boy he had mourned so deeply after the accident, the one he had thought was his, wasn't truly his son. And now, why now? "Why are you telling me this now?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking. Eleanor looked down, shame washing over her. "Laura passed away a few months ago," she admitted. "Cancer. On her deathbed, she told me everything and asked me to do the right thing. It's taken me this long to summon the courage to come here." Fernando walked to the window, staring out as he tried to make sense of it all. His emotions clashed. Confusion, pain, anger, but also, surprisingly, a flicker of joy. Mateo, the boy who had unexpectedly entered his life, was truly his son. "Mateo doesn't know about any of this, does he?" Fernando asked, turning to face Eleanor. She shook her head. "No, we never told him. We thought it was better that way." Fernando nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Now he understood the resemblance, the instant bond he had felt with Mateo. It wasn't just compassion or memories of Tomás. It was the unbreakable connection between a father and his child. "What do we do now?" he asked, more to himself than to Elena. "That's up to you, Mr. Lopez," she replied softly. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but Mateo's a good boy. He's been through so much. All I want is what's best for him." Fernando rubbed his face, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "I need time," he said finally. "I need to think about how to handle this, how to tell Mateo." Elena stood, nodding in understanding. "I get it," she said. She placed a card on the desk. "Here's my number. Please, call me when you've made a decision." Fernando sat quietly in his study, staring at the torn envelope on his desk. The room was silent, except for the muffled sounds of life coming from the rest of the house. Inside that envelope were DNA results, proof that Mateo was his biological son. For months, Fernando had cared for Mateo, loved him as his own, and now this piece of paper confirmed what he could hardly believe. His hands trembled as he unfolded the document, scanning the words that solidified Elena's claim. Each line sent a wave of emotions crashing over him. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mateo waited patiently, unaware of the storm about to uproot his life forever. Fernando's heart felt heavier with each passing second. He needed to act, to speak, but how could he begin? What could he possibly say to a child who had already endured so much pain? Mateo had lost nearly everything, and now Fernando was about to upend his world once again. A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. "Fernando?" Mateo's voice was cautious, but tinged with concern. "Are you okay? You've been in there all day." Taking a deep breath, Fernando steadied himself and answered, "I'm fine, Mateo. Come in. We need to talk." His tone was calm, surprisingly steady, though his chest tightened with nerves. The door creaked open, and Mateo stepped in, his face a mix of worry and curiosity. "Is something wrong?" the boy asked, perching on the chair across from the desk. Fernando looked at him closely, studying his features like it was the first time he'd really seen him. Now he noticed the resemblance, the shape of Matteo's eyes, the faint curve of his smile. Camilla's traits were unmistakable. How had he missed it before? "Matteo," Fernando began, choosing his words carefully, "do you remember when you told me you didn't know much about your parents?" Matteo nodded, slowly, his brow furrowed. "Yeah. My grandma said my mum was really young when she had me, and that my dad left before I was born." Fernando felt a lump in his throat as he knelt down to Matteo's level. "What if I told you there's more to the story than you were told?" The boy stiffened, confusion clouding his eyes. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Fernando took his hands gently. "This morning, I had a visit from someone named Elena," he explained. She's your grandmother, Matteo. Your real grandmother." Silence filled the space between them as the weight of the truth began to sink in. Matteo shook his head, confusion clouding his face. "But my grandma passed away. You know that," he said. "I know. That's what you've been told," Fernando replied gently. "But the truth is much more complicated." Taking a deep breath, Fernando began to explain in the clearest and kindest way he could about the mix-up at the hospital years ago when Matteo was born. He told him about Laura, her long-kept secret, and the DNA results. With every word, Matteo's world seemed to fall apart and piece itself back together all at once. "So are you my dad?" Matteo asked finally, his voice trembling. "My real dad?" Fernando nodded, feeling tears sting the corners of his eyes. "Yes, Matteo. According to these tests, I'm your biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Matteo stared into the distance, struggling to process everything he'd just heard. Fernando wanted to comfort him, to pull him into a hug, but he hesitated, unsure how Matteo would react. Finally, Matteo broke the quiet. "What about Tomas?" he asked, his voice soft. "The boy in the picture?" Fernando sighed. "Tomas was the child of another couple," he explained gently. "We raised him as our own, loved him like our son, but biologically, he wasn't ours." Matteo suddenly stood up, backing away from Fernando. "Why are you telling me this now?" he demanded, his voice a mix of confusion and anger. "Why are you turning my world upside down again?" The heartbreak in Matteo's eyes was almost too much for Fernando to bear. "Because you deserve to know the truth, Matteo," Fernando said softly. "You're my son, and I need you to know that. I want to give you the place you've always deserved in this family." Matteo shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't get it," he whispered. "I need time to think." Before Fernando could respond, Matteo bolted from the office. Fernando instinctively moved to follow, but stopped himself at the door. Maybe Matteo needed space. Time to process this life-altering revelation. Returning to his desk, Fernando sank into his chair, his exhaustion both emotional and physical. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be legal hurdles, conversations with Helena, and a reckoning with the past. But for now, the only thing that truly mattered was Matteo, his son, the boy who had entered his life in the most unexpected way and was now a profound connection to Camila that Fernando hadn't dared to imagine. His gaze fell on a framed photo of Camila sitting on his desk. "What should I do now, my love?" he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "How can I help our son through this?" There was no answer, of course. But as he stared at Camilla's radiant smile, a renewed determination surged through him. No matter how hard it got, he would do everything in his power to make Matteo feel loved, safe, and at home in this family. Because that's what they were now. A family, different, complicated, but a family nonetheless. With a deep breath, Fernando stood. It was time to find Mateo. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but they would face it together. Step by step, day by day, they would build the future they both deserved. As Fernando left the office, he couldn't predict the obstacles still waiting for them, but he knew one thing for certain. They would face them as father and son. Challenges would test their love, patience, and resolve in ways they never anticipated. The days after the revelation were fraught with tension and overwhelming emotions. Mateo became withdrawn, spending most of his time behind the closed door of his room. Fernando, though understanding of Mateo's need for space, found himself helpless in the face of his son's newly unearthed pain. One afternoon, while Fernando was working in his home office, a soft knock disrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Carmen or Rogelio. To his surprise, it was Mateo who entered, his eyes red and his expression resolute. "I want to meet her," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Fernando blinked, confused for a moment. "Her?" Mateo nodded. "Elena. My grandmother," he clarified, the word grandmother sounding unfamiliar on his lips. "I want to learn more about my mum, about my family." Fernando felt a flicker of irrational jealousy, but he quickly pushed it aside. Of course, Mateo would want to understand more about where he came from. "All right," Fernando said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I can call her and arrange a meeting, if that's what you want." Mateo nodded, but stayed rooted in place. After a pause, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" Fernando turned toward him, giving him his full attention. "Of course, Mateo. Anything." Mateo took a deep breath before continuing. "If you hadn't found out I was your son, would you have adopted me anyway?" The question hit Fernando like a punch to the gut. Rising from his chair, he knelt in front of Mateo, looking him directly in the eyes. "Mateo, listen to me," he said firmly, though his voice remained gentle. "From the moment you came into my life, I knew you were special. Son or not, I already thought of you as family. I was considering adoption long before I learned the truth." Tears welled up in Mateo's eyes. "Really?" he asked, his voice trembling. Fernando nodded, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Really? Mateo, I know all of this feels confusing and scary, but you need to understand, no matter how you came into my life, I'm grateful you did. Are you my son? In every way that matters." Overcome with emotion, Mateo threw his arms around Fernando, his quiet sobs muffled against his shoulder. Fernando held him tightly, feeling a knot in his chest begin to unravel. "I love you, Dad," Mateo murmured through his tears. Fernando's heart swelled. It was the first time Mateo had called him Dad. "I love you too, son," Fernando replied, his voice breaking with emotion. "More than you can imagine." That moment marked a turning point in their relationship. While questions remained and challenges lay ahead, Fernando knew they were finally moving forward. In the days that followed, Fernando reached out to Elena and arranged a meeting in a nearby park, a neutral space where Mateo could feel at ease. The day of the meeting arrived faster than they had anticipated. Fernando and Mateo strolled together toward the park, the boy clutching nervously onto his father's hand. Seated on a bench, Elena anxiously twisted a handkerchief between her fingers. When she spotted them approaching, her gaze locked onto Mateo. "Hi, Mateo," she greeted softly, her voice trembling and her eyes glistening with tears. I'm your grandmother, Elena." Mateo looked up at Fernando, who nodded encouragingly. "Hi," he replied hesitantly. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a photo, her hands shaking as she offered it to Matteo. "This is your mother, Laura," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "When you were a baby, you looked just like her." Matteo took the picture, studying it intently. Fernando quietly watched as his son's eyes scanned every detail of Laura's face, searching for familiar traits. Finally, Matteo asked, "What was she like?" Elena smiled through her tears. She was brave and kind, had the most infectious laugh, and she loved books, and she loved you, Matteo, more than anything in the world. As Elena shared memories of Laura, Fernando remained quiet, observing the moment. A swirl of emotions churned within him. Happiness for Matteo, who was finally connecting with his roots, sorrow for the lost time, and a flicker of fear that this new bond might somehow overshadow his own relationship with his son. But when Matteo turned to him, his eyes sparkling with excitement, and said, "Dad, did you hear that? Mum was a nurse just like yours." Fernando felt his worries melt away. The visit stretched over several hours, filled with laughter, tears, and endless questions. As they said their goodbyes, promising to meet again soon, Fernando was surprised to feel a wave of gratitude toward Elena. Despite everything, she had cherished Matteo all these years and now seemed ready to share that love. Later that night, as Fernando tucked Matteo into bed, the boy looked at him seriously. "Dad, do you think Mum Camilla would have loved me?" Matteo asked. Fernando's throat tightened. Stroking his son's hair gently, he replied, "Oh, Matteo, Camilla would have adored you. You were the baby we dreamed of, and even though we couldn't create you, I know she's watching over us, smiling." Matteo's face lit up with relief. "Good night, Dad," he murmured, closing his eyes. "Good night, son," Fernando whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. As Fernando left the room, he paused at the door, gazing at his sleeping child. Life had taken unexpected turns, but somehow it felt like things were finally falling into place. What he couldn't foresee, though, was that fate still had a few twists in store, challenges that would test their new family in unimaginable ways. In the silence of his office, Fernando's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Lopez, we have information about the accident that killed your wife and child. Things aren't what they seem. We'll be in touch soon." Fernando stared at the screen, a chill creeping down his spine. Just as he thought life was finally settling into a rhythm, the past threatened to rear its head and throw his carefully rebuilt world into chaos. That night, Fernando couldn't sleep. The cryptic message kept looping through his mind, stirring up questions he thought he had long buried. What wasn't as it seemed about the accident? And who could possibly be behind such a message? By morning, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a strong cup of coffee was his only companion. As he mulled over whether to confide in Matteo or shield him from further worry, Fernando decided that honesty was the only path forward. Over breakfast, he took a deep breath and said, "Matteo, there's something I need to tell you." The boy looked up from his cereal bowl, his curiosity piqued by his father's serious tone. "What's wrong, Dad?" Fernando exhaled slowly before answering. "I got a strange message last night. Someone claims to have information about the accident that killed Camila and Tomas." Matteo froze, his spoon slipping from his hand and splashing milk onto the table. "What? What kind of information?" "I don't know for sure," Fernando admitted. "The message was vague, but I want you to know about it. I don't want to keep any secrets." Matteo nodded slowly, processing the revelation. "So, what do we do now?" Fernando was caught off guard by the "we." Despite everything, Matteo saw himself as part of this, part of the family. "For now, we wait," Fernando replied. but I've hired a private investigator to dig into the message's source. I need to know who we're dealing with before making any moves." The following days were tense. Fernando couldn't stop checking his phone, waiting for another message, while juggling his responsibilities at home and work. Mateo, meanwhile, grew quieter, seemingly lost in thought. A week after the initial message, the investigator, a man named Javier Soto, arrived at the Lopez estate with a preliminary report. "Mr. Lopez," Javier said, settling into the chair across from Fernando in his study. "We've traced the origin of the message. It was sent from a disposable phone, but we identified the buyer, someone named Roberto Mendez." Fernando frowned, struggling to place the name. "Roberto Mendez? It sounds familiar, but I can't quite place him." Javier nodded and pulled a photograph from his briefcase. "He worked in your accounting department about 6 years ago. He was let go after some irregularities in the books." Fernando studied the photograph, the man's face stirring an old memory. "Wait, I remember now. Mendez claimed he uncovered some suspicious transactions in the company, but when we asked for proof, he couldn't provide anything concrete. We eventually fired him for spreading baseless rumors." Javier leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Mr. Lopez, there's something else you need to know. In looking into Mendez's background, we discovered he had connections to some rather radical activist groups. Groups critical of corporate practices similar to those of his company had been gaining traction recently." Fernando felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Lopez," Javier interrupted firmly. "I'm simply laying out the facts. But, under the circumstances, we should consider that your wife and son's deaths may not have been accidental." The world seemed to stop for Fernando. The notion that Camila and Tomas's deaths could be more than just a heartbreaking tragedy was too overwhelming to process. I need a moment," he muttered, standing up and moving toward the window. As he gazed out at the yard, where Mateo was playing soccer, Fernando felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. How could he protect his newly discovered son when even the foundation of his past was slipping away? A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. It was Mateo. "Dad?" the boy asked cautiously, eyeing Javier with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" Fernando looked at his son, then at Javier, and made a decision. "Mateo, come here," he said, extending his hand. "There's something we need to discuss as a family." As Mateo came closer, Fernando braced himself for a conversation that would forever alter their lives. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would face it together with his son. What none of them realized was that, at that very moment, Roberto Mendez was watching them from a car parked across the street. His face was set with determination. The past was about to collide with the present, and the fallout would be unpredictable. In the days that followed, Fernando found himself swept up in a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. With Javier's help, he launched a thorough investigation into the accident that had shattered his life 5 years earlier. Every new piece of information seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Mateo wrestled with his own emotions, torn between curiosity and fear. The idea that the tragedy defining his father's life might not have been an accident filled him with a storm of feelings he could barely articulate. One afternoon, as Fernando sifted through old documents in his study, Mateo timidly stepped inside. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Fernando looked up, noticing the seriousness in his son's expression. "Of course, Mateo. What's on your mind?" The boy hesitated before speaking. "If you find out that what happened to Mum Camila and Tomas wasn't an accident, what will you do?" The question hit Fernando like a punch to the gut. He had thought about it countless times, but hearing it from his son made it all the more real. "I don't know for sure, Matteo," he admitted honestly. "But I can promise you this. Whatever decision I make, it will be for our family. For us." Matteo nodded, though Fernando could see something else was troubling him. "What's bothering you, son?" Matteo hesitated again, his voice barely a whisper. "What if the people who hurt them come after us? Are we in danger now?" Fernando felt his chest tighten. He hadn't wanted to burden Matteo with his fears, but it was clear the boy was more perceptive than he'd realized. "Listen to me, Matteo," Fernando said gently. Fernando knelt down in front of his son, his voice steady but honest. "Matteo, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't fully understand what we're dealing with right now." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and continued, "But I need you to know that I'll do everything in my power to keep us safe. We've tightened security around the house and are being extra cautious. You don't have to be afraid." Matteo wrapped his arms tightly around his father. "I love you, Dad." Fernando hugged him back, holding him close. "I love you too, son," he whispered, realizing that no matter what happened, he held the most important thing in the world right there in his arms. Later that night, as Matteo slept, Fernando's phone buzzed. It was Javier. "Mr. Lopez, I think we've found something," said the investigator, his tone urgent. "We need to meet immediately." Half an hour later, Fernando was seated in a discreet downtown cafe. Javier arrived shortly after, carrying a thick folder under his arm. Fernando leaned forward. "What did you find?" he asked, barely able to contain his anxiety. Javier opened the folder, revealing a stack of photos and documents. "We've been digging into Roberto Mendez' activities in the months leading up to the accident," Javier began, his expression serious. "And we've uncovered something troubling." Fernando leaned closer, scanning the photographs. They showed Mendez meeting with several men who looked anything but trustworthy. "Who are these people?" Fernando asked, his voice tight. Javier's answer was chilling. "They're members of a radical activist group called Corporate Justice. They specialize in sabotage and attacks on companies they deem corrupt or environmentally harmful." Fernando felt a chill run through him. "Are you suggesting this group might be connected to the accident that killed Camila and Tomás?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Javier nodded gravely and pulled out another document. It was a financial report. "We've traced suspicious transfers of large sums of money to an offshore account tied to Mendez. These transfers occurred right after the accident." Fernando's chest tightened, his breathing shallow. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a horrifying picture. "Are you saying someone paid Mendez to murder my family?" Fernando demanded, his voice trembling with fury. Javier hesitated. "It's a theory," he admitted, "but we need more concrete evidence before making any accusations." Fernando ran a hand over his face, his mind reeling. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. Javier looked at him carefully. "I think it's time to confront Mendez directly. We have enough to pressure him, maybe even get him to confess." Fernando nodded slowly, determination hardening his features. "Let's do it. But I want to be there when you question him." Javier hesitated. "Mr. Lopez, I'm not sure that's wise." Fernando cut him off firmly. "It's not a request, Javier. I need to look him in the eye. I need answers." Reluctantly, Javier agreed, and they planned to meet the next day to strategize their approach. When Fernando returned home, he found Matteo waiting for him in the living room, his young face lined with worry. "Dad, where were you?" the boy asked, his voice small but anxious. Fernando sat down beside him, pulling him into a reassuring hug. "Just working on something important, Matteo. I promise everything is going to be okay." Fernando sat on the couch next to his son, torn between shielding him from the harsh truth and being upfront. Matteo's gaze searched his father's face, his voice cautious as he began. "We've learned something about what happened to Camilla and Thomas." Matteo froze, his expression tight with worry. "What do you mean? It was an accident, right?" Fernando took a deep breath before responding, his tone heavy with uncertainty. "We're not entirely sure yet. There's some evidence suggesting it might not have been an accident after all." Matteo's silence stretched for a moment as he tried to absorb what his father was saying. Finally, he asked, "Are you going to find out who's responsible?" Fernando nodded firmly. "We're going to do our best." He placed a reassuring hand on Matteo's shoulder. "But, no matter what happens, your safety is my #1 priority." Matteo leaned in, hugging his father tightly. "Be careful, Dad. I can't lose you too." A lump formed in Fernando's throat, but he managed a soft reply. "You won't lose me. I promise. We're in this together, remember?" That night, while Matteo slept soundly, Fernando sat up, lost in thought, reviewing everything they'd uncovered. The notion that someone might have intentionally orchestrated Camilla and Thomas's deaths stirred a fury within Fernando that was hard to suppress. At the same time, Matteo's words lingered in his mind, cautioning him against recklessness. Was it worth risking their new life together to chase vengeance? Or was it better to leave the past behind and focus on building a future for his son? As dawn approached, Fernando made his choice. He would seek the truth, not for revenge, but for justice. For Camilla, for Thomas, and most importantly, for Matteo. His son deserved to know the truth about his family, their history, and the events that had shaped their lives. What Fernando couldn't foresee was that his decision would set off a chain of events, testing not only his resolve, but also the strength of their newly formed bond. Meanwhile, across town, Roberto Mendez stared at an old photograph of Fernando Lopez and his family. With trembling hands, he dialed a number on his phone. His voice was barely audible as he said, "They know. Lopez is digging into it. We need to act now." The threads of fate were beginning to weave tighter, pulling Fernando and Matteo into an outcome neither could anticipate. The tension was palpable as Fernando and Javier sat in a small cafe on the edge of town, waiting. They had agreed to meet Roberto Mendez here, far from prying eyes and unwanted attention. Fernando's fingers drummed restlessly on the table, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to confront Mendez, demand answers, maybe even pursue vengeance. But another part, the part that thought of Matteo's well-being, urged him to remain calm, to uncover the truth without jeopardizing what they had built. "He's here," Javier murmured, leaning toward Fernando. Roberto Mendez stepped into the cafe, his eyes darting around nervously before landing on Fernando. For a brief moment, he hesitated, as though considering retreat. But finally, with cautious, deliberate steps, he approached the table. "Mr. Lopez," he greeted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time." Fernando stared at Roberto, searching that familiar face for any trace of the truth he'd been chasing for so long. "Sit down, Roberto," he said, his voice cold and measured. "We have a lot to discuss." Mendez sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the table. "I suppose you've figured some things out," he began, glancing nervously between Fernando and Javier. "We know about your ties to corporate justice," Javier said bluntly, "and the money transfers that followed the accident." Mendez went pale. "It's not what you think," he stammered. I had nothing to do with the accident, I swear." Fernando leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Then explain, Roberto, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you orchestrated the deaths of my wife and son." Mendez shook his head fervently. No, that's not it. I found out something. Something big at the company. Embezzlement, shady contracts, things involving the board of directors. I tried to tell Mr. Lopez, but no one would listen. Fernando frowned, recalling vague allegations Mendes had made before he was fired. And how does that tie into the accident? Mendes took a deep breath before answering. I reached out to corporate justice. I thought they could help me expose the truth, but things spiraled out of control. They didn't just want to reveal information, they wanted to send a message. Fernando felt his blood run cold. Are you saying they... Mendes nodded, tears welling in his eyes. They planned the accident, but I swear, I didn't know. By the time I found out, it was too late. The money. They paid me to stay silent. Fernando shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. You took hush money? You knew the truth all this time and said nothing. Javier quickly stepped in, placing a hand on Fernando's shoulder. Mr. Lopez, please, calm down. Mendes shrank in his chair, fear etched across his face. I'm sorry, he murmured. I'm so sorry. I've lived with this guilt for years. That's why I sent the message. I needed you to know the truth. Fernando sank back into his chair, feeling drained. Who? He asked at last. Who on the board was involved? Mendes pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. Everything's in here. Names, dates, transactions, everything you need to expose them. Fernando stared at the envelope, its weight tangible, even before opening it. Why now? He asked. Why tell me all this now? Mendes looked down, his voice quiet. Because I'm dying, Mr. Lopez. Cancer. I don't have much time left, and I had to do one thing right before the end. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Fernando stared intently at the envelope, feeling that it held not only the truth about Camila and Tomas's deaths, but also the power to dismantle the company he had spent years building. What are you going to do now, Mr. Lopez? Javier asked softly. Fernando thought about Mateo and the new life they were building together. He thought about Camila and Tomas, about the justice they deserved, and about the employees of his company, innocent people who might suffer if everything came to light. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. I'm going to do the right thing, he said at last, for my family, for Camila and Tomas's memory, and for everyone who trusts me. As they left the cafe, Fernando paused and looked back at Mendes one last time. Thank you for the truth, Roberto. I hope you find peace. Mendes nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Mr. Lopez, for everything. Later that night, back home, Fernando hugged Mateo tightly. Is everything okay, Dad? Mateo asked, sensing the emotion in his father's embrace. Fernando smiled, feeling a mix of sorrow and hope. It will be, Mateo. I promise you. As Mateo slept, Fernando sat at his desk with the opened envelope from Mendes in front of him and made a decision. He would reveal the truth, clean up his company, and honor Camila and Tomas's memory. But he would do it in a way that spared innocent people. With determination, he began drafting a plan for justice, redemption, and a fresh start. What Fernando didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter filled with challenges, but also hope and new opportunities. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Fernando and Mateo. Armed with the information from Mendes, Fernando began a quiet but thorough cleanup of his company. Collaborating closely with a team of trusted lawyers and auditors, he started untangling the web of corruption that had taken root at the highest levels. The process was grueling and emotionally draining. Fernando had to confront old friends and colleagues, some of whom were deeply involved in illegal activities. Each new discovery felt like a punch to the gut, reminding him of how blind he had been to what was happening under his nose. Amid the chaos and uncertainty, Fernando found strength in Mateo. The boy's natural curiosity and kind heart became a constant source of support and motivation. One night, as they worked on a puzzle together, Mateo asked a question that caught Fernando off guard. "Dad, do you think Mum, Camilla, would be proud of what you're doing?" Fernando paused, a lump forming in his throat. "I hope so, Mateo," he said finally. "Camilla always valued honesty and integrity above everything else. I believe she'd want us to do what's right, no matter how hard it is." Mateo nodded thoughtfully. "I think she would be proud," he said firmly. "And Tomas, too." Fernando felt tears well up in his eyes, deeply moved by his son's words and conviction. He extended his hand and gently squeezed Mateo's. "Thank you, son. You don't know how much this means to me." As the investigation progressed, Fernando made a pivotal decision. Instead of airing the scandal publicly, which could have brought the company to its knees and jeopardized the livelihoods of thousands of innocent workers, he chose a quieter path. Working discreetly with the authorities, Fernando systematically removed corrupt elements from the organization. Those directly involved in illegal activities were handed over to the authorities, while others were quietly removed from their roles. Simultaneously, Fernando initiated sweeping internal reforms to prevent future misconduct. He established an independent ethics committee, revamped the internal audit processes, and created confidential channels for employees to report irregularities without fear of retaliation. The journey was arduous, but over time, Fernando began to see progress. The company started regaining its reputation, and employees, noticing the positive changes, renewed their commitment and loyalty. Meanwhile, Fernando's relationship with Mateo continued to flourish. The young boy, inspired by his father's unwavering determination, began taking an interest in the workings of the company and the principles of business ethics. One evening, as Fernando reviewed some documents in his home office, Mateo cautiously entered. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Fernando looked up, smiling warmly. "Of course, Mateo. What's on your mind?" The boy hesitated before speaking. "Do you think I could work with you someday? Help you keep the company good?" A wave of emotion washed over Fernando. The thought of Mateo wanting to follow in his footsteps, not for money or power, but out of a desire to do good, filled him with immense pride. "Mateo," he said, standing to embrace his son, "nothing would make me happier. But remember, you have your whole life ahead of you to decide what you want to do." Mateo nodded, though his eyes held a quiet resolve. "I know, Dad, but I want to do something that matters, something that helps people." That night, after Mateo had fallen asleep, Fernando found himself reflecting on how much his life had transformed in such a short time. From a man consumed by loneliness and grief, he had grown into a devoted father and an ethical leader in the business world. Yet, one issue still lingered, something Fernando had been putting off for months. With a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had long memorized. "Elena, it's Fernando Lopez. I think it's time we talked about Mateo's future, about his legal adoption." The conversation was long and emotional. Though Elena had come to accept that Mateo was thriving with Fernando, the idea of relinquishing her legal rights as his grandmother was heart-wrenching. "I understand how hard this is, Elena," Fernando said gently. "But I want Mateo to have the security of a permanent home, and I want you to remain part of his life. I'm not trying to replace you. I just want to give him the stability he deserves." After many tears and heartfelt promises, Elena finally agreed. They agreed to begin the adoption process on the condition that she retained the right to regular visits. The next day, when Fernando shared the news with Mateo, the boy's reaction caught him off guard. "But, Dad," Mateo said, his brows furrowed, "I'm already your son. Why do we need a judge to tell us that?" Fernando crouched down to Mateo's level, gently taking his hands. "You are my son, in every way that matters, Mateo. This is just to make sure no one can ever take us away from each other. Do you understand?" Slowly, Mateo nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "So, I'll officially be Mateo Lopez." Fernando smiled back, his heart swelling with love. "Yes, son, you'll officially be Mateo Lopez." The adoption process moved forward swiftly, thanks to Fernando's connections and Elena's cooperation. On a sunny spring morning, Fernando and Mateo stood before a judge to make official what they had already known in their hearts. They were father and son. As the judge pronounced the decision, Fernando couldn't help but think of Camila and Tomás. Somehow, fate had woven their lives with Mateo's, bringing light and hope where there had once been only darkness. "Congratulations, Mateo Lopez," the judge said warmly. "And congratulations to you as well, Mr. Lopez. You are officially father and son." Mateo threw himself into Fernando's arms, both of them overwhelmed with tears of joy. "I love you, Dad," Mateo whispered. "I love you too, son," Fernando replied, holding the boy tightly, knowing his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. As they left the courthouse, hand in hand, they realized this wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of something new, a future filled with promise, challenges, and most importantly, love. What they didn't know was that destiny had one more surprise in store for them, one that would test their newly formed family in ways they could never have foreseen. The morning sun rose high over the city, bathing the streets in a warm, golden light that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. At the Lopez mansion, Fernando woke early, as had become his routine in recent months. He tiptoed to Mateo's room, smiling at the sight of his son fast asleep, clutching the teddy bear Fernando had given him on their adoption day. While preparing breakfast, Fernando reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year, the transformation of his business, adopting Mateo, and the healing and forgiveness that had shaped him. It all felt almost too good to be true. The sound of sleepy footsteps broke his thoughts. Mateo shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled, climbing onto a chair. "Morning, champ," Fernando replied, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Ready for the big day?" Mateo nodded, his face lighting up with a bright smile. Today was a big day for Fernando. He was set to officially launch the Camila and Tomás Lopez Foundation, a non-profit focused on supporting homeless children and promoting ethical business practices. "Do you think Mum Camila and Tomás would have liked this idea?" Mateo asked, his mouth full of pancakes. Fernando felt a swell of emotion in his chest. "I'm sure they would have loved it, Mateo, especially knowing you helped plan it." And it was true. Mateo had been a vital part of shaping the foundation, contributing ideas and insights that only a child with first-hand experience of life on the streets could offer. As they got ready to leave, Fernando's phone buzzed. It was Helena. "Good morning, Fernando," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "I just wanted to wish you luck today. I'll be watching the presentation on TV." "Thanks, Helena," Fernando replied sincerely. "That means a lot to us." Over the past few months, his relationship with Helena had taken a positive turn. At first, it had been tough for Helena to come to terms with Mateo's adoption. But over time, she'd stopped seeing Fernando as competition and started viewing him as a partner in giving Mateo the love and care he deserved. The foundation's launch turned out to be a huge success. Standing next to Mateo, Fernando delivered a heartfelt speech about corporate social responsibility and community impact. "This foundation," he said, his voice echoing through the packed auditorium, was born not just out of pain and loss, but from the hope of a fresh start. It's built on the belief that every child deserves a chance, and that businesses have the power and the responsibility to create positive change in the world. As he finished, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. But the most touching moment came when Matteo stepped up to the microphone. "My dad taught me that we can turn pain into something good," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly, with nerves but steady with determination. "I hope this foundation helps many kids find a home and family like I did," Matteo added. Not a single eye in the room was dry after his words. That evening, back at home, Fernando and Matteo sat in the backyard, gazing up at the stars. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Matteo said suddenly, "for everything you've done." Fernando felt a lump in his throat. "And I'm proud of you, Matteo, more than you could ever know." Under the shimmering night sky, Fernando reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd faced profound loss, but discovered a love and resilience he hadn't realized he had. "You know, Matteo," he said softly, "sometimes I think Camilla and Tomas brought us together so we could heal." Matteo snuggled closer. "I think so too, Dad." Just then, as if the universe agreed, a shooting star streaked across the sky, sealing their bond with a celestial flourish. "Look, Dad," Matteo exclaimed, pointing at the sky. "Make a wish." Fernando closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, he smiled softly and pulled his son into a warm embrace. "I don't need to wish for anything, Matteo," he said quietly. "Everything I could ever want is right here with me." Under the sparkling stars, Fernando and Matteo Lopez, a father and son bound by love and destiny, gazed ahead with determination and hope. They understood that challenges lay ahead, but they also knew their bond would give them the strength to overcome anything. Their story wasn't just about loss and redemption. It was about love, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human heart to heal and grow. Even in life's darkest moments, their journey stood as a testament to how light finds a way through, bringing the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered above, father and son sat together in silence, grateful for the present and eager for the future they would face hand in hand as the family they were always meant to be.